Welcome back to The Wilder Ride, where we are getting wilder by the minute, a podcast where we are breaking down and celebrating the Gene Wilder... I've had way too much alcohol camping this weekend. Take two. Let's try that again.
Inside this room, all of my dreams become realities, and some of my realities become dreams.
What in the wide, wide world of sports is going on here? Alive! It's alive! It's alive!
You are listening to The Wilder Ride, getting wilder by the minute. Here are your hosts, Alan Sanders and Walt Murray.
And welcome back to The Wilder Ride, getting wilder by the minute, a podcast where we are breaking down and celebrating the Gene Wilder film, Young Frankenstein, one ongoing tease at a time. I'm Alan Sanders, your host.
I'm Walt Murray, your co-host.
And it is our extraordinary pleasure to welcome to our podcast a voice that's very well known in the Movies by Minutes world, a guy from the Indiana Jones Minute podcasting team. We have Pete Mummert. Pete, thanks for joining us.
Thanks. That was an amazing introduction. Thank you. Happy to be here.
All off the top of my head, no show prep. As you could tell from I couldn't even introduce Gene Wilder's name. You know I'm winging it. Anyway, no, we are so glad to have you here with us on The Wilder Ride as we are beginning to actually head toward the final minutes of the movie. And you've got, I think, a pretty good segment of minutes here that we've invited you to be with us on. But before we start, anytime we bring in a guest for the very first time, we always try to get a kind of background. Where does Young Frankenstein fit in with you in terms of your movie history and especially comedies?
You know, I saw it as a kid, or at least pieces of it, and then it sort of dropped off my radar for a long, long time. And so it was nice to revisit it again for this podcast, because it had been a long, long time since I've seen this.
So but you had some memory of it. Was it nice to kind of see it almost for the first time if it's been a while? Yeah,
it was. And I have watched a lot of, Universal horror movies in the interim. And so it was nice seeing it. When I saw it as a kid, it was just a movie on its own. And it's nice seeing it with that lens, like, oh, wow, this is, there's a lot that went before this that helps explain the movie.
As far as comedies go in Gene Wilder, obviously that's going to be our motif here. Rather than picking a franchise, we chose to pick an actor because there's at least a dozen or more films. There's some smaller films we may not get to, but there's at least a dozen films that we just absolutely love with Gene Wilder. What are your thoughts on Gene?
I love Gene Wilder. I especially like the Richard Pryor stuff he did.
What about as far as a favorite role? Because you can have a favorite movie that may not necessarily be the favorite role. So I'm going to ask you that question. What's your favorite movie that he's been in, and what's your favorite role that he's played?
I think my favorite movie he was in is Silver Streak. Favorite role? That's a good question. That's a little bit tougher. I'm going to have to come back to you on that one. I got to think about that one.
Well, I was going to ask you, Young Frankenstein is my favorite of his movies, but I really do enjoy his work with Richard Pryor. And I was going to ask you, I guess you've already answered the question, but what is your favorite work that he and Richard Pryor did together, and why does that one stand out to you?
Actually, that may be my favorite role is actually Stir Crazy. I don't know, that one, I saw that when I was a kid, and it just, I thought that was the funniest movie I'd ever seen when I saw it. And I just, his deadpan with Richard Pryor in that movie, I think is just sublime. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, I think the way they play off of each other too is their work together in Silver Streak is great, but they do have a real chemistry that is unique in Stir Crazy that I really like as well.
Well, amazing when you pick Stir Crazy, considering that was the one causing the most amount of grief behind the scenes when Sidney Poitier was ready to fire Pryor with all of his not showing up high, just losing day after shooting. And it's amazing that they were able to still capture something on screen that did not belie at all what was happening off screen.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's amazing how often that ends up being the case in movies, too.
Well, I appreciate you guys. We had Tom Taylor on earlier. I appreciate you being here. We tried to get Jerry, but for some reason, I don't know, a calendar and scheduling is just not a thing for him.
Yeah, that's not an easy thing for him to do.
I guess he can keep track of the beats in his head for drumming and going all over the country playing, but something about what you want. Oh, Sunday. Okay, apparently Sunday means something different to him. So
yeah, we had a whole month of shows scheduled with guests, and about a week before we heard, "Oh, I'm going on tour."
Isn't that great?
Gosh.
We actually, I'm calling out Jerry, but only in fun. We actually had to do something that I don't know how, if you guys have had to do this. We've had to actually start recording episodes out of order, like you're shooting a movie, and then we start finding ourselves, did we already talk about this, or is this something coming up later, or is this something we already covered? And so it's been crazy the last, I don't know, Walt, the last, 7 or 8 recording sessions?
Yeah, and, they talk about the magic of Hollywood. That doesn't translate into the magic of podcasting.
No.
It's the mayhem of podcasting.
Yeah, those are tough.
I've actually found myself saying, I said something like, okay, but remember when we talked about this, Walt? And then I'd say, wait a minute, did we talk about it yet? Maybe we're about to talk about it. I remember talking about it, but this minute actually comes before the minute we already talked about, so I can't say that.
Yeah, welcome to my world on a daily basis.
Well, let's go ahead and dive into this minute then. Since we are here, we are going to have a chunk of minutes all in a row, and a nice actual scene or a moment of this movie. We're going to be with Elizabeth for a while. We're going to start off minute number 91, where Dr. Frankenstein, now I guess it's Frankenstein.
It is Frankenstein.
He's decided to embrace it. So Dr. Frankenstein says to Elizabeth, "Oh, I suppose you're right." And Elizabeth will end with, "You're a tough guy." And that's where we are in between. Just a very nice conversation here between what should be fiancés. I mean, 2 people engaged, ready to tie the knot. In fact, it got delayed because he had to come to Transylvania here to claim his inheritance. So, Pete, let me start with you. What do you gauge the relationship between Dr. Frankenstein and Elizabeth?
I have had a hard time figuring this out, and I haven't figured this out. Definitely, I think it's a big tell when he refers to her stumblingly as his financier earlier. And I can see why he is into her, but I can't quite figure out what she wants from him. Because, I mean, she plays this entire scene like a con artist. And she's pushing him, she's kind of dragging him along, and she's definitely not giving him what he wants. But I can't quite figure out what she's holding out for. Like, does she just want to be married to a successful doctor? Which it doesn't seem like that would necessarily be the case, because she seems like she's got a pretty successful life already.
Well, she mentions that she's got, later, we know she's got money. We obviously know she's a socialite. Walt, the comments that we've had with some of our prior guests is, well, that's sort of the role of the socialite. Even if you come from money, you have to stay in good standing in your circle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that. But there's a dynamic in this relationship that is really a mess.
Well, I'm just trying to address what Pete was saying about why is she interested in him.
Well, and I think that kind of goes to that. I can't really put these two together on any level. I mean, because we know that the Frankenstein name is not a great one. And they every Frankenstein for the last 5 generations has destroyed a town. And
5 movies.
5 movies. And so and he's been trying to run away from this name, but it's just a shadow of the name anyway. So I still don't get what it is that she sees here.
I think because he said earlier in the movie that he is a surgeon of some renown, and you don't get this from. You get it from the script, from reading the stage direction, but it doesn't necessarily show it. But it's Johns Hopkins University is where he's teaching at the very beginning. So not an unprestigious university.
No.
So he's obviously made him say a name for himself as a doctor. I'm going to go back to what one of our early guests, Susan Delmonico, that week when they first are on the trains platform and they're having that awkward goodbye. And she said they probably bumped into each other at some kind of a fundraiser or something for the hospital. He was there. She was there. Somebody whispered, he's the up-and-coming doctor. He's brilliant. Oh, a doctor. I should have one of those. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, that may be as close as I can get. Because I'm kind of with Pete. Like, I scratch my head over this relationship constantly. And, one of the things that I was thinking as I was preparing for this minute is that the 2 relationships that he has are completely different. Because his relationship with Inga, he is the strong personality. He's kind of he's the mentor of the relationship. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now it's starting to turn romantic, and that hasn't changed. She still kind of defers to him. In this relationship, I see her as the strong hand. And she really leads this relationship. She makes all the decisions in it. So they're 2 very, very different relationships. And, I think that maybe you're right, Pete. Maybe that tell where he said my financier may be the big piece for him. I mean, obviously she's an attractive woman, and he tries to maul her in this minute. But
he's been trying to maul her any chance he gets.
Yeah. He's sitting at her feet, kind of like he's a puppy.
Right.
And it's interesting that he still kind of wants to maul her here, even after he's just had his little elevation thing with Terry Garr.
Well, something that we talked about last week, I think it was last week, or maybe it was the week before, when this was all coming to fruition, there is a big giant passage in the script that was taken out of the movie where he justifies if they do anything, as long as they're only talking intellectually, that's okay, because they would never want to have anything, quote, physical, even though they physically did something. In their minds, they called it intellectual conversation, which leads to the joke when, just a few minutes ago, when Elizabeth shows up and asks, what is it that you do? And she says, well, we have very intellectual conversations. In fact, we were just having one.
Yeah.
And that's when he goes, right. So we all get that what's happening, but we fleshed it out a little bit more, knowing that in the script, the quote, intellectual conversation was sort of code word. We're not really doing anything wrong because this is intellectual conversation.
Right.
So this is definitely different. She is 100% right back in charge. And we ended last Friday with him at her feet, basically sighing about his monster on the loose. And she's like, oh, don't worry about it, Freddy. No, don't worry about it. She doesn't even care.
No.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, that the way they film it, like the cinematography, I think, gives us kind of an interesting clue to how the movie at least is portraying her, is when you see her in this scene, they kind of they nail that old Universal look where it almost looks like they have Vaseline on the camera. Like she's in soft focus, the lights are all in soft focus, and you see her, she's the heroine, she's the woman that he's destined to be with per the movie. And they'll eventually kind of turn that on its head. But I think it's interesting that they're kind of playing with the type here.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you pointed that out, especially in any of her close-ups. You see the candlelight behind her, and it's lens flare off of each of those candles because they're using such heavy lens filtering to just kind of, again, like you said, not only just a soft focus, but they're literally trying to make it look almost starry-eyed in this scene.
Well, and Pete, we've talked about this before, and I hope the listeners aren't going, oh, Lord, here goes Walt with that question again. But we've asked this a lot, that if this scene had been shot in color, how do you think it would be different, and do you think it would be as good a scene? And really the movie as a whole, what are your thoughts on the black and white versus how it would be different if they shot this in color?
Yeah, I have a hard time imagining this working in black and white. I mean, in color. Like, it feels like this has to be black and white. But just, I mean, the tenor of the movie is that it's kind of an homage, but at the same time kind of playing with the tropes of the old horror movies. And it's hard to imagine that in color. It just seems like a different movie. Like, you feel like you're in the 70s if it's in color.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think some of the other movies that were similar failed because they were in color and just couldn't capture that same feel.
And it takes you out of the feeling of the movie. Like, it doesn't seem like the same characters that it doesn't seem like Frankenstein and the monster and, Elizabeth. If you take them if you put them into color, they seem like new characters in a new movie.
Yeah, I feel like you're supposed to almost consider this part of now the Universal franchise. Like, this is the sixth now movie in the franchise. And
yeah.
And if you had been in color, it would have been completely out of that mold.
I think so, too. Too.
During this, the exchange of lines here, there's actually a couple of lines taken out here, and there's actually a stage direction added.
Oh.
And by stage direction, I mean Gene Wilder doing something completely on the fly. Right after he says, what would I do without you? And then she puts on this little kitty, almost, oh my God, sex pot kind of voice.
Is your room just down the hall in case I get the frights during the night?
Is your room just down the hall in case I get the frights in the middle of the night? And when she says that, I'm like, I'm ready to jump into the screen.
Right.
I mean, that is such a tease come on voice, right? And Freddy says, well, yes, but I thought perhaps tonight, under the circumstances, I might stay here with you. What's been cut out, Elizabeth is supposed to say, oh, darling, don't let's spoil everything. And Freddy says, I don't want to spoil anything. I just want to top it all off.
Okay. Interesting.
So they cut that out. And then it goes right to, would you want me now, like this, so soon on our wedding? And there's a pause. No stage direction at all that he is supposed to literally leap and try to begin to embrace her chest. He just does it.
Whoa! Oh boy! Or
And she's like, oh, get off of me.
Well, finally, I got my wife to watch this movie, and we were talking about this scene because I knew this was coming up. And she made a comment that both actors are playing this from their appropriate gender roles. That he is acting like a man would act. She's acting like, for the most part, like a woman would act, where he's just like, she's kind of laying out the nice, warm relationship stuff, and he's like, oh no, I'm good with it. I'm great. Let's go.
When he does do the whole mauling thing, and she so stays in the character mode, she realizes, once again, almost like on the train station back episodes or minutes 13 and 14, she just doesn't even want him touching her unless she calls it, Right. You look at her face, she almost, like you said, the whole thing about as if the dog had jumped on her lap, and she's like, no, you cannot be on mommy's lap. You have to get down.
And why? It's interesting because she's obviously, other people have touched her before, and she obviously,
right.
I can't quite figure out why she's so against that with him. Unless it's just purely that she wants to control him. It's almost like, he's got his monster that he's creating, and she's creating Gene Wilder in this movie. Like, she's creating Frankenstein.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that about that. She's obviously been with other people. We've had listeners, specifically some of our female listeners in the listeners group, who don't buy that. They think we're full of it. I think we're going to be proven right here in this week's worth of minutes. Well, maybe not this week's, but we're certainly going to get an indication, because next week is for sure.
Yeah, we're getting close.
But Pete, I'm agreeing with you. She seems to know her way around manipulating men. And this is not naivete. This is not the virgin, socialite. This is somebody she knows how to play the town, and she knows how to play men.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Well, I like I said, I can't remember. I was 5th or 6th grade, maybe 7th grade at the latest when I saw this movie. I did not like her. I did not like Madeline Kahn after this movie. Mm-hmm. And
why?
Because of this scene. I just thought she was
toying with him?
Yeah, just thought she was really manipulating him, and
Then you grew up and realized that's all women.
I am not going to comment on that. Well, I think as I got older, number one, I realized what a good actress she is, and that she is playing this part. I mean, what do they call it? Chewing the scenery. I mean, even her overacting in this scene is fantastic. And she is conveying exactly what needs to be conveyed here.
What I think is because she's not acting for the camera, she's acting for Freddy.
That's right.
So the fact that it's a little over the top works because it's because of him. She's trying to manipulate him, and he buys into it. He loves this, vaudeville type performance she's putting on.
Yeah, and I think that later on when I saw her in Blazing Saddles, I realized that she is just good at this. She plays this part really well. I don't know that I would have conveyed it in this way at that time, but she has a great way of kind of oozing sexuality and capturing the moment and really toying with him in a way that makes sense in this movie and really helps us to get to where we're going next.
Let me remind our audience about a fact, depending when you stumble across. Sometimes people like to listen off and on. They know the movie so well, they may not be listening to it in complete order. But here's something that Gene Wilder said behind the scenes, saying, and this is a fact if you didn't know, surprisingly, Madeline Kahn initially actually did turn down the role of Inga, which is what they wanted her to play initially. Gene Wilder wrote it for her, and after he saw her as Lily von Stupp in Blazing Saddles. But Madeline Kahn wanted to play the fiancée, and I thought she must be nuts, he said. Once I saw her in character, he realized she could turn any role into a diva. And the New Yorker said of Kahn's performance, Kahn has an extra dimension of sexiness, almost like Mae West had. She's so lascivious, and she convinces you that she really digs the monster. So in this sense, Madeline Kahn actually was able to kind of convince both Gene Wilder and Mel Brooks that she was better for this part. And Pete, I think Madeline Kahn is so good, she probably could have done justice to either role. I think Terry Garr is great as Inga. I don't know if I would have bought Terry Garr being able to do what Madeline Kahn does in this role.
Yeah, I that's hard for me to imagine too. And I do think Terry Garr is sublime as Inga.
Well, and I think Madeline Kahn, too, plays a strong woman really, really well, and I don't know how she would do as kind of the more reserved,
Yeah, but she's got the acting chops. I think she could have. I would have believed it.
Probably. It would have been interesting to see, and I can't think of a part that she played where she played in that role. Off the top of my head, I mean, there's probably some very obvious one, but she always plays a strong. As far as I can remember, she always plays a strong woman role.
True. When he dives on her chest and then she pushes him away and, says, don't you want to wait a little while? I can wait till I can give myself without hesitation when I can be totally and unashamedly and legally yours. This is one of those, again, he doesn't break the fourth wall, Walt. And it's been a while since he's done this, but he almost is like looking out at that. He knows there's somebody out there watching this scene. And he's pausing and considering. He says, that's a tough choice. The response in the script was supposed to be Elizabeth continuing, is it worth taking a chance? Instead, she, on the fly, improv'd and said, you're a tough guy. Which I think was great because he goes, that's a tough choice. And she uses the word tough to try to flatter him, at the same time make him realize, I'm not backing down.
Right.
And I think that's just a brilliant Madeline Kahn in the moment, improving this scene with Gene Wilder. And the fact that she can hang with Gene Wilder says an awful lot.
Yeah, she's fantastic. I'm glad that I came around on her pretty quick and realized how good she is. So, and I think it's funny too because when he kind of has that stare, it's like any guy who's ever had a girlfriend is like, oh, yeah, I can relate to this feeling.
And then Elizabeth has regained the upper hand after the momentary mauling of Dr. Frankenstein because when he says, I suppose you're right. Of course I am. I always am.
Yes.
Of course I am.
I caught that line too. Yep.
Yeah. And I like she does the little air kiss.
Yep. Well, she is definitely in control of this relationship.
Mm.
Oh, yeah. I think we've established that since the very, very beginning. Yeah. In fact, that he was so panicked when he found out that she was arriving that night.
Yeah. Well, and I think any of us would have been in that
case, yeah. There may have been multiple reasons for
I'm
that.
going to put on a tie.
We begin to end this minute with, of course, of course I am, I'm always right. Now give me a kiss and say goodnight like a good boy. I think if we were worrying about the dog analogy being too much of a stretch, I think that pretty much solidifies it.
Yeah, that takes care of it.
So, because I don't want to necessarily just race to the next minute, because I always love having time with our guests, has anyone here had this kind of a relationship where you just realized, and it took a while, but it was always one-sided?
Oh, yeah. And I'm sure that there are probably a few women who I dated in my past who are like, yeah, that's, I can also relate to that. I can also relate to dating a selfish jackass.
I am very clearly pulling on a memory from a girl that I had kind of just met, and it was before I met a person that I was going to actually be with for a little while. But I was kind of in between girlfriends, and I was out of college, and I was just wrapping up college, and I decided on a whim to send her flowers because I knew kind of who she was, but I was like, well, let's just see if this works. So I'm just going to send flowers, and it got me a date. And I was like, oh, this is cool. And we went out 2 or 3 times, but I always kept feeling like, she's like, well, what are you getting me tonight? What are you getting me? What are you getting me? So I guess it kind of fizzled because I realized, thankfully not as long as it took Dr. Frankenstein here, I realized, oh, okay, I sent you flowers out of the clear blue. You realize it was like $25, $30 or whatever at the time. You're like, oh, this guy's got money. And so you wanted to go out. But then all of a sudden it's like, well, what'd you get me today? And so I was like, I stopped. And the funny thing was, after about 1.5 years, when I had gotten hooked up with what was going to be my first wife, out of nowhere, she calls and goes, hey, haven't heard from you in a while. I'm like, yeah, sorry, I'm dating somebody else. Too bad. But it took me 3 or 4 dates to realize, oh my gosh, she just had an impression of me that I was deep pockets.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever given off that air, but but when I was a freshman in college,
I didn't say I was.
No, I don't think I've given off that air. How can somebody
the
own
other
that
air
many
you're
t-shirts?
giving off? I don't need. That's
yeah, that probably is true.
We need a scented candle in here.
Renews it. Well, my freshman year of college, I I went out with, my roommate hooked me up with somebody. We went out once, and it was okay, and we went out a second time, and she brought a bride's magazine and started talking about me meeting her grandmother. And I was like, okay, well, I'm done here.
Easy on cool it on the jets there, honey.
I'm like,
I'm looking for an intellectual conversation.
I will not be calling tomorrow. Yeah, that was maybe the shortest date I've ever had.
Of course, I'm talking at it the way Freddy's talking about it. I just want the intellectual conversation.
At that point, I was like,
know what I mean?
I don't want anything. I'm out.
Yeah. See ya.
Hit the eject button.
Pete, you got anything that pops into your head? Anything? A one-sided relationship that you realized you just had to kind of put an end to it?
Well, it didn't even get to relationship status, but I remember there was a woman in college that I was crazy about for a while, and she had agreed to go out to dinner with me. And the day we were going to go out to dinner, we were sitting in in our dormitory lobby, and this kind of hunky guy walked by that was a friend of hers. And he's like, "Oh, you guys are going out?" And she's like, Pete's like my brother.
That's like a wet blanket just thrown on that fire.
Yeah. But I guess fortunately it happened early on.
Yeah, thank God, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, my daughter likes the term friend zone. I was like, yeah, I probably spent my first 25 years in the friend zone.
That was me in high school. And it pissed me off so much growing up. I could hang out. I had like 5 or 6 different girls always hanging out at the same lunch table. Hey, you want to go out? I'm not going to go out. You're like my brother. Like, what? You're too nice. Yeah. What do you mean I'm too nice?
Yeah, I know. That was always the killer for me.
At what point does that start becoming the thing you're looking for in a guy? You're too nice. Wait, what? I want the bad boy. And now I've got daughters, and I'm like, you better not go for the bad boy.
Yeah.
Right.
You pick the guy that's too nice, okay? Anyway, because they all want the same thing, but at least he's going to be nice about it. But, all right, well, as we begin to wrap up here, minute number 91, Walt, is there anything in this particular part of the conversation, because it's going to continue into the next minute, anything we didn't cover here? Anything about the background scenery, anything?
The only other thing that I thought was worth mentioning is this highlights again Gene's calm and crazy in this minute too, because you see his very intentional, calm, kind of quiet demeanor, a little bit of the crack when he, tries to tackle her, but you kind of have that low ebb for him right now, and that does really, I've noticed that contrast more and more as we've gone through this movie minute by minute of his crazy highs and his really calm lows, and how he is really the master of those emotional ups and downs.
Yeah, I think so. And that's something that I think brings such genuine likability to him, even when he's being manic, or maybe when he might be being a jerk momentarily. There's still that likability factor for him.
There is. Mm-hmm. And you can relate to that, trying to get control of a situation and not being able to, and having that kind of slip through your fingers. He is very relatable.
Yeah, I think we've all related to what's happening in this scene here, as we can have all attested. We have at least one story. I know I have multiple, but I told just one. Pete, what about you? Notes for this minute? Anything we forgot to chat about?
No, I think we covered it all.
One thing I want to mention before we start to wrap up, right around the 10-second mark, we get a close-up on Gene Wilder's face, and I'm going to go another stash alert. We have now grown back together. The reverse Hitler is not quite so prominent there. The big gap seems to have filled in nicely since the last time we saw it. So I like when a mustache can morph on us from moment to moment.
Yeah, and I don't know if we know this, but I'm wondering what order they shot this in. And did they shoot all the Elizabeth scenes around the same time? And his mustache was in the tighter pattern at that point, and the other stuff later.
It's more normal here. It's not doing the swoop with the big wide gap and looking almost like they pressed it on and did it wrong.
Confounding.
It is, but it's funny to watch.
It is.
So, we got a good shot of his eyeliner here, where he wants to look like that 30s matinee idol of the day. So he's definitely pulling off that 30s look here.
Yeah,
I think the last note is just bears repeating. When they're in these close-ups, right, starting at about second 10 through when it pulls back to the medium shot, you can see just how soft focus this is. It's noticeable. Like the last scene we were just in was a sharp focus, and the lab was sharp. Everything's been really crisp, and then all of a sudden here we are, very fuzzy, very soft, to give that sort of almost otherworldliness, and it makes her look like, you know, she's the diva that she's actually playing.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, as we begin to wrap up 91 here, before we start to tease what's coming up tomorrow, Pete, you've got a kind of an interesting podcast that maybe one or two people have heard about by now. You want to give a quick plug for where you guys can be heard?
Oh, yeah. I do a show called the Indiana Jones Minute with my co-hosts Tom and Jerry. And the names, I guess, are pretty fitting. And we basically do the same thing you guys do, but with the Indiana Jones movies.
And at the time we're recording this, you guys are closing in. I don't know where you are in terms of actual recording, but I know as of the time this gets released, you might be wrapping up the movie The Last Crusade. So I guess we'll look for, early 2019 when you guys decide whether or not there is a fourth Indiana Jones movie?
Yeah, I think we've come to the dawning dreadful realization that there is a fourth movie, and it will be coming out probably beginning of 2019.
I can't wait. If you guys are having some meltdowns in The Last Crusade, especially Jerry, I'm waiting for, what's the line in Jaws? He's going to have a heart attack when you see what he brought him.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I almost wonder if he's going to go the opposite way and end up loving the movie.
You know what? That's my fear. I've only seen it once, and it was so horrid. I even bought it, and I refused to watch it, even though I haven't. It's on my DVD shelf, still wrapped in cellophane. But I have a feeling I'm going to watch it because I really want to be at least on one episode with these guys, and it figures by the time I come up, it's freaking Kingdom of the Crystal Skull.
Well, we've got a spot reserved for you.
Which is great. You got an absolute idiot who knows nothing talking about a movie that's terrible. It's just terrible.
Well, I mean, the good thing is you will have, I don't know how many minutes it is, 90 minutes of great insults as you go through that movie.
You know what? Here's what I'm going to project. I'm going to predict this right now, and I'm doing it now before we even get there. You will see masterful direction of scenes with absolute horrible storytelling.
Yeah.
I can't disagree with that.
I think when you look back, you're going to see action sequences. You're like, oh, that would have looked so much better had the special effects had been finished. Or that would have looked so much better had they not had this particular storyline going on or this particular line. I think you're going to see some great camera movement and some great direction, but you're going to see, what the hell went wrong with this movie?
Yeah. Yeah. And I watched it recently. I was on a really long plane flight, and I watched all four movies. They had them all on the in-flight theater, and I watched all four back to back, I guess. And I was surprised how much more I liked it than I did the first time. And there were a lot of huge problems with it, and there were parts where it were just hard to watch. But overall, I was sort of surprised that I liked it as much as I did. And I'm curious if other people are going to have that reaction.
Yeah, me too, especially hearing the audience. You had a couple of guests the week that I was listening leading up to this podcast that said, well, Last Crusade used to be my favorite. But a lot of it really does come down to when you first get introduced to any movie. I mean, I look back, there are certain movies that will always be like the golden standard because I watched them somewhere between the ages of 7 and 14, and that magic range, those are movies I still to this day cherish. And I think a lot of people, when they were between 7 to 14, they may have seen Last Crusade, or they may have, God forbid, seen Crystal Skull. And so that's their introduction to the world.
Yeah, like the kids that grew up watching Phantom Menace.
Yeah, poor kids.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
All right, well, Walt, as we wrap up, where can people learn a little bit more about us?
Well, the best place to find us is
What an idiot.
.facebook.com/thewilderride.
So cut that right out.
I just do it by habit now. But facebook.com/thewilderride. Join our group there. Get in the listeners group. That is really where a lot of great discussion goes on. We've had polls up over different things, and a lot of great stuff gets posted in there too. Our good friend BK from BK on the Air goes out and finds production photos and other things that are just fantastic and strike up some good conversations. So would love for you to join us there. Also, if you're listening on iTunes, if you don't mind going out and give us a rating there. If you like what you're hearing, we would really encourage you to give us a 5-star, and be sure and make a comment. And that allows people to find us a little bit easier if they're looking for something on Gene or on Young Frankenstein or something along that lines.
All right, and if you like what you're hearing, we want to encourage you to come back tomorrow, because minute number 92, we have Dr. Frankenstein. I've been saying Frankenstein for so long. Dr. Frankenstein admitting, I suppose you're right. And we'll end with Elizabeth singing a hymn, Glory, Glory, Hallelujah. We're going to find out why, of all the songs, are we digging back to what sounds like a Civil War era song. All of that coming your way on this, The Wilder Ride.
It is Frankenstein.
It is. It really is.
Frankenstein, I'm sure he answers anything.
Oh, darling.